Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we take a stack of dense articles, research, and notes and extract the most important nuggets of knowledge to help you get well-informed fast.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're plunging into a pivotal moment in history, a time when the world was gripped by radical change, perhaps not so different from our own in some ways.
Yeah, that's a good point.
To set the stage, picture this: the late 19th century. It's a landscape just utterly dominated by the grimy, often brutal reality of the Industrial Revolution.
It's a really stark image, isn't it? I mean, imagine workers toiling away in factories, sometimes for, 16 hours a day, their bodies and minds quite literally stupefied, as the sources say, by the excessive labor.
Yeah, stupefied, that's a strong word.
And you've got the smokestacks just belching black soot over these sprawling urban slums. It's a testament to a system where human beings were often just seen as, cogs in a relentless machine, instruments for making money.
A system creating immense wealth, sure, but also just widespread, heart-wrenching misery alongside it.
Exactly. It wasn't a simple picture.
And it wasn't just adults suffering. I think what's truly heartbreaking is the child labor. Children far too young, sent into dark, dangerous mines or these suffocating workshops.
Oh, absolutely. Their youthful promise was blighted before it could even blossom. True education, forget it. It became a distant, impossible dream for so many.
And all this desperation, this visible suffering, it wasn't just sitting there quietly. It was brewing something, wasn't it? A storm.
Precisely. This whole crucible of social upheaval, it fueled this undeniable revolutionary fervor right across Europe. You had socialist and communist movements gaining serious ground.
Advocating for really radical systemic overthrow.
Right, often stirring up envy of the rich, inciting people to revolt. So on one side, you've got this unchecked, often ruthless capitalism, huge wealth for a few, widespread poverty for the masses.
And on the other?
On the other, these growing, sometimes violent, calls for a complete reordering of society. The tension was just palpable, a real ideological conflict threatening to tear societies apart.
So in this boiling pot of social unrest, stark economic disparity, you might expect a solution. Maybe from a fiery labor leader or a political revolutionary.
That's what you'd think.
But you mentioned earlier an unexpected voice emerging. So where did it come from? And why was it so surprising, maybe, for the Catholic Church to step into this really tumultuous arena?
And that's where our deep dive gets truly fascinating. Because into this whole maelstrom, this unexpected yet incredibly profound voice emerged. Not from the streets, not from the parliament.
From the Vatican.
Exactly, from the Vatican. It was a voice that would dramatically shift the whole conversation about economic, social justice, human dignity, forever, really.
Wow.
So today, our deep dive is going to explore how one 19th century papal document, Rerum Novarum, which literally means of new things or of revolutionary change, didn't just comment on this chaos. It actually laid a foundational stone for modern social thought that still resonates today.
Of new things. That title itself is significant.
It really is. It's a remarkable story of, ancient wisdom confronting brand new challenges. And it set a precedent for how the church would engage with the world's most pressing social issues from then on.
Okay, so if this document was so pivotal, we need to talk about the figure behind it, who finally stepped onto that stage from the Catholic Church. Tell us about Pope Leo XIII.
Right. So our story really begins with Gioacchino Pecci. He became Pope Leo XIII in 1878. And honestly, when he was elected, a lot of people expected his papacy to be pretty brief.
Why was that? His age.
Yeah, his age, his perceived frail health. But he completely defied those expectations. He ended up leading the church for a remarkable 25 years.
25 years, wow.
Yeah, and he became one of the most intellectually engaged and influential popes in modern history. He really set the stage for what we now call Catholic social teaching.
And his vision for the church, you mentioned, was incredibly forward-thinking, especially compared to his predecessor, Pius IX, who was known for being quite conservative, condemning aspects of modernity. What was Leo's approach?
Well, he believed the church had this vital mission, not just in spiritual matters, important as they are, but also in things like political sociology, social justice, upholding human rights, and dignity. He saw the church as needing to actively engage with this rapidly changing world.
Rather than just retreat or condemn.
Exactly. Not just retreat from it or, simply condemn it. And this was a huge shift. It was made even more significant because he was the first pope since way back in the 8th century. Stephen II, I think, never to have held direct control over the papal states.
Right. Those had been dissolved in 1870. That must have changed things fundamentally.
It really did. That loss of sort of temporal secular power actually forced the church to reevaluate its role. It had to find its voice and relevance in a world that was becoming increasingly secular, so it led it to focus much more intensely on its moral authority and social guidance.
That's a really crucial point. So this commitment he had, it wasn't just theoretical talk. He was actually involved in charity, tackling social issues, even before becoming pope.
Oh, absolutely. That's right. Even before becoming pope, when he was an archbishop, Pecci was known for his practical charity, his deep pastoral heart. He founded homeless shelters for boys, for girls, for elderly women right there in his diocese.
Wow.
He opened what were called Monte di Pieta banks. These were essentially like community-run pawn shops or credit unions offering low-interest loans to low-income people. A direct counter to the rapacious usury, the loan sharking that he'd later condemn in the encyclical.
So practical solutions.
Practical solutions. He also created soup kitchens. And here's a telling little story. When he was made a cardinal back in 1853, he famously donated all the resources that were planned for his big cardinalate celebrations to victims of earthquakes and floods.
That really speaks volumes.
It does. He wasn't just, observing the misery of the working classes from afar. He was actively trying to alleviate it. And that gave him this crucial firsthand experience of the stark realities of the Industrial Revolution that Rerum Novarum would directly address later on.
That practical experience must have profoundly shaped his perspective then. So Leo XIII wasn't just some abstract intellectual. He was a man of action, seeing suffering firsthand.
Exactly.
And it's this grim reality, this moment of the Industrial Revolution's dark side, that really pushed him to write Rerum Novarum. What was life actually like for the average worker back then? Can you paint a picture?
Well, the conditions were just horrific for so many. The encyclical itself, it really doesn't pull any punches. It explicitly points out that human beings were being used, and I quote, as mere instruments for money-making.
Just instruments.
Yeah, and it said it was neither just nor human, so to grind men down with excessive labor as to stupefy their minds and wear out their bodies. Imagine working, say, 16 hours a day, 6, maybe 7 days a week, unsafe factories, no ventilation, no safety gear, exposed to dangerous machinery, just to barely survive. That was the daily grind for millions.
It's hard to even comprehend that level of exploitation.
Yeah.
And beyond the adults, you mentioned the child labor issue earlier. That was rampant, wasn't it? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely rampant. It's hard to stomach, isn't it? Just picturing a child in a dark mine, it really underscores the urgency of the moment Leo XIII was addressing.
It really does.
Children were literally put into workshops and factories before their bodies and minds were even remotely developed enough. The encyclical condemned this practice unequivocally. It recognized it was, quote, blighting their young promise and making any kind of real education impossible.
And the cities themselves were often squalid, right? Severe urban poverty was a huge feature.
Huge. Largely due to what Rerum Novarum called the unchecked capitalism of the time. You had the concentration of hiring, labor, trade, all in the hands of just a few very rich men. And this, as the document starkly puts it, had laid a yoke little better than that of slavery itself on the teeming masses of the laboring poor.
A yoke little better than slavery. Strong words.
Very strong. It highlighted the hard-heartedness of employers, the greed of unchecked competition, and also that rapacious usury, again, charging sky-high interest rates to people who were desperate.
And another key factor here, historically, that made workers so uniquely vulnerable was the disappearance of the old working men's guilds, right? Before the Industrial Revolution, these provided some protection.
They did, a degree of protection, training, a sense of community, but their abolition, or just their fading away, left this massive void.
How did the encyclical see that?
It explicitly notes that the abolition of these ancient guilds, which were kind of like medieval trade unions mixed with social safety nets, providing training, community, protection for workers in their specific craft, it left them surrendered, isolated, and helpless, with no other protective organization.
So basically stripping away a traditional buffer.
Exactly. It removed this traditional intermediary layer that had, for centuries really, buffered workers from the raw, harsh forces of the market. This truly set the stage for widespread exploitation and created this volatile ideological battleground we talked about.
Okay, so let's look at that battleground. On one side, you had pure laissez-faire capitalism. Its core idea was unrestrained market forces. The market fixes itself, leads to the best outcomes. But in reality,
In reality, it often led to immense wealth for a very small number of people and just widespread misery for many, many others.
How did Rerum Novarum tackle that specific view?
It directly criticized this unbridled approach. It stated flat out that the free operation of market forces must be tempered by moral considerations. It wasn't optional. The encyclical called out the cruelty of grasping speculators who use human beings as mere instruments for making money.
So it wasn't anti-market per se, but anti-unmoral market.
Precisely. It wasn't saying markets were inherently evil, but that they absolutely could not operate outside of a moral framework that valued human dignity above pure profit. That was non-negotiable.
Then on the other extreme, you had these rapidly growing socialist and communist movements, offering a totally radical alternative. Get rid of private property altogether.
Right. And they often incited, as the encyclical notes, envy of the rich and stirred the people to revolt. They definitely had an appeal.
So how did the church navigate that? It sounds like a real tightrope walk.
It was a profound dilemma. Leo XIII acknowledged their rapid growth. He understood the appeal of their promises to the suffering masses. But the church had this long-standing principle: private property as a natural right, essential for human nature, for the family.
So how do you defend that right while also addressing the very real, very widespread injustices and suffering caused by its, well, unchecked exercise?
That was the crux of the problem. The church believed deeply that some opportune remedy must be found quickly for the misery and wretchedness pressing so unjustly on the majority of the working class. But it needed a solution that was both moral and practical, one that was clearly distinct from the extremes of both unbridled capitalism and revolutionary socialism.
Trying to carve out a third way.
Exactly. That was the incredibly complex historical context that prompted Leo XIII to issue Rerum Novarum. It was a bold attempt to chart that third path.
And it was, as you said, truly a revolutionary document, right from its title. Rerum Novarum, of new things, of revolutionary change. It signals its intent immediately. The encyclical itself says it was prompted by the spirit of revolutionary change, affecting everything: politics, economics, society.
Yeah, it wasn't shying away from the scale of the moment at all. It was the Catholic Church's formal, comprehensive response to this massive social conflict that came out of industrialization and the rise of these powerful competing ideologies.
And it made a strong claim about the church's own role in finding a solution.
Right from the start, Leo XIII emphasized that, quote, "No practical solution of this question will be found apart from the intervention of religion and of the church." This wasn't just presented as, a political analysis or an economic plan. It was deeply theological.
Grounding its proposals in Christian principles.
Absolutely, and asserting the church's moral authority right there in the public square, which, for its time, was a very bold move, especially given the recent loss of the papal states.
Okay, so given this backdrop, moral conviction, practical engagement, what were these key principles that really set Rerum Novarum apart? What was the absolute core idea?
The absolute bedrock, the foundational claim, without a doubt, was human dignity. This document, coming from the Pope, dared to declare something truly revolutionary for its time: the inherent worth of every single worker, no matter how poor, no matter how exploited.
That sounds simple now, maybe, but back then.
Back then, it was radical. It asserted that workers are not mere cogs in a machine. They're not commodities to be bought and sold at the lowest possible price. They're not just instruments of production.
They're persons.
Persons, created in God's image, possessing immortal souls, reason, free will. And to treat them as anything less, the encyclical states very clearly, is truly shameful and inhuman. How did that claim immediately challenge the way people thought about labor?
Well, it completely flipped the script, didn't it? It meant employers suddenly had this profound moral responsibility. They had to respect workers' dignity. They had to ensure conditions allowed for time, for religious duties, for family life. They had to provide safe and moral working environments.
Exactly. It's this powerful assertion that profit should never come at the expense of a human being's fundamental, inherent worth.
So dignity first. And building on that respect for the person, the encyclical then vigorously defends the natural right to private property. This was crucial in distinguishing it from socialism.
Absolutely crucial. Socialism wanted to abolish it entirely. Leo XIII argued that private property is essential for human existence, for self-preservation. It's part of what distinguishes humans from animals. We can plan for the future. We invest our labor. We create lasting goods.
And he connects it directly to labor, right?
Very directly. The encyclical makes this compelling case that property derived from your own labor, like, say, you till some land or you build a house, it becomes, quote, truly part of itself and should belong to the person who did the work. It asks this powerful rhetorical question. Is it just that the fruit of a man's own sweat and labor should be possessed and enjoyed by anyone else?
It's a strong argument.
Mm-hmm.
And this feels like a really critical, but this right to private property isn't presented as absolute or unrestrained, is it?
No, absolutely not. And that's key. The encyclical makes it abundantly clear that this right comes with significant social obligations. Those who are, quote, blessed with a large share of temporal blessings, basically, the wealthy have a moral duty to use them for the benefit of others.
How so?
By sharing without hesitation when others are in need. It even quotes St. Thomas Aquinas on this point. Now, this is presented mainly as a duty of Christian charity, not necessarily strict legal justice, except perhaps in extreme cases of dire need where withholding help could itself be unjust.
Okay, so charity, but a strong moral obligation.
A very strong one. And it also emphasizes that the right to property applies really strongly to the head of a family. It enables them to provide for their children, to leave an inheritance, securing the family's future, its stability, which is seen as a key component of human flourishing.
Okay, so dignity, property with obligations. What about the actual exchange? Labor for wages. That was and still is a huge point of contention. What did Rerum Novarum propose for a just wage theory?
This was genuinely groundbreaking for its time. The encyclical acknowledges, yes, wages are regulated by free consent, by a contract between employer and employee, but then it immediately adds something crucial. There underlies a dictate of natural justice more imperious and ancient than any bargain between man and man.
More important than the contract itself.
Yes. This underlying dictate, it says, is that wages ought not to be insufficient to support a frugal and well-behaved wage earner. It didn't just stop there. It went further, recommending wages sufficient to enable him comfortably to support himself, his wife, and his children.
The whole family.
The whole family. And with enough left over, ideally, for some little savings, so they could actually improve their condition over time, maybe even acquire some property themselves.
That was a radical idea in a world where wages were often just driven down to subsistence level by market forces alone.
Totally radical. And the document explicitly warns that if a worker accepts harder conditions simply through necessity or fear of a worse evil, then they are effectively made the victim of force and injustice. It strongly implies that a wage below this living standard is fundamentally an injustice.
Powerful stuff. And it also championed another critical right for workers, the right to association, forming unions. This must have been a huge affirmation when workers trying to organize often faced really harsh opposition, even violence.
Huge. The encyclical strongly supports workers' right to form unions. It calls them working men's unions, and even says they are the most important of all private societies or associations.
Did it look back to those guilds again?
It did. It explicitly notes the historical precedent of the artificers' guilds, which, as we discussed, offered advantages like training, mutual aid, and promoting the quality of their craft. And crucially, it asserts that the state has a positive duty to protect this natural right to associate, not to suppress or destroy it.
What about existing unions that maybe weren't aligned with Christian principles?
That's addressed too. There's a practical point made for Christian workers. It encourages them to form their own associations if the existing ones are, quote, managed on principles ill according with Christianity, or if they essentially force working men either to join them or to starve. So it wasn't just a theoretical right, it was a call for practical collective action and protection.
Okay, and finally, there's a principle that, while maybe not explicitly named Rerum Novarum, you said is implicitly there and became a cornerstone of Catholic social teaching later on, the subsidiary principle. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, you're right. The actual term subsidiarity wasn't coined until Pope Pius XI's encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, 40 years later, in 1931. But the core idea is definitely present in Rerum Novarum.
So what's the core idea?
Think of it like this. Problems should be solved and decisions should be made at the lowest possible or most local level that's effective. If an individual, a family, or a local community can handle an issue themselves, then a higher level of authority like the state shouldn't just jump in and take over that responsibility unnecessarily.
So it's about empowering smaller groups.
Exactly. It's about empowering individuals, families, local associations, and only calling on higher authority when it's truly necessary. The state, Rerum Novarum argued, should not absorb the individual or the family. It should allow them free and untrammeled action as long as it's consistent with the common good and the rights of others.
So when would state intervention be legitimate, according to this principle?
The encyclical says state intervention is legitimate, even necessary, only when the general interest or any particular class suffers or is threatened with harm, which can in no other way be met or prevented.
Can you give some examples it mentioned?
Sure. It gives concrete examples like danger to public peace arising from strikes or disorder, if family life starts to break down, if religious duties are widely neglected because of work demands, if working conditions in factories are dangerous or immoral, if employers lay unjust burdens on workers, or if health is endangered by excessive labor or work unsuitable for a person's sex or age.
But with a limit.
Yes, and this is crucial for subsidiarity. The law should only intervene as much as is required to remedy the specific evil, no more than that. It's seeking this careful balance, avoiding both total state control, like in socialism, and the absolute hands-off approach of pure laissez-faire capitalism.
Okay, so we've laid out this powerful, positive vision Rerum Novarum presented. But to really grasp its significance, we also need to look at what it firmly rejected. It wasn't just offering an alternative, it was actively pushing back against the dominant extremes of its time.
It absolutely was, and this dual rejection is really key to understanding its position and its enduring relevance. On the one hand, it firmly, unequivocally rejected socialism's core idea, the abolition of private property.
Why was that seen as so fundamentally wrong?
It was seen as manifestly against justice, for starters, but also fundamentally contradictory to human nature. Leo argued it would lead to utter confusion and disorder in the community and ultimately result in misery and degradation for everyone, especially the workers it claimed to help. He argued that while people might be equal in inherent dignity, striving for perfect equality in social standing or possessions was unrealistic because of natural differences in things like capability, diligence, health, and strength. And crucially, taking away private property would, in his view, essentially defraud man of what his own labor has produced, and severely undermine the family's ability to provide for itself and plan for the future.
Okay, so a strong rejection of socialism. But importantly, it equally opposed unrestricted capitalism, that pure laissez-faire approach. Sometimes people overlook this part, focusing only on the anti-socialist message.
That's a really important point. Rerum Novarum was just as scathing, maybe even more so in places, about the cruelty of grasping speculators and the reduction of human beings to mere instruments for money-making.
So it wasn't just criticizing theory, but lived reality.
Exactly. It argued strongly against the hard-heartedness of employers and the greed of unchecked competition. It explicitly acknowledged the immense misery and wretchedness being inflicted upon the poor, and it made it crystal clear that the state does have a role, indeed a duty, to intervene to ensure that the poor are housed, clothed, and enabled to support life. That was a direct challenge to the prevailing notion that the market, left entirely alone, would magically solve all problems.
So this document wasn't about picking a side in the existing fight. It was really trying to chart a completely new course.
That's it exactly. A new course that affirmed the rights and the duties of both labor and capital within a moral framework.
So Rerum Novarum didn't just reject these extremes. It actively put forward a positive vision for society. You mentioned harmony between capital and labor. How did it envision that working?
Well, it fundamentally rejected the idea that class is naturally hostile to class, which was a core tenet of Marxist thought. Instead, it posited that capital and labor are actually interdependent. They need each other. As the encyclical says, each needs the other. Capital cannot do without labor, nor labor without capital.
So it was almost like a radical call for peace, or at least cooperation, in the workplace, rather than the class warfare narrative.
Precisely. The goal, then, wasn't conflict, but mutual agreement resulting in good order. And how is this to be fostered? Through Christian institutions and applying Christian precepts that could bind the different classes together in friendliness and good feeling, ultimately aiming for something like brotherly love or at least mutual respect and fairness.
But what about the role of the state in this positive vision?
The state's primary purpose, according to Rerum Novarum, was to promote the common good. And that meant protecting the rights and caring for the needs of all citizens, but with a special emphasis on the poor and vulnerable because, as it points out, they are in every city very largely in the majority and often lack the means to protect themselves. This document was really a blueprint for a more just, more humane society, rooted firmly in the dignity of every human person and aimed at fostering genuine social peace, not just suppressing conflict.
Okay, so this powerful document lands in 1891. Its reception must have been quite something. How was it received initially, especially within the church itself and by its ideological opponents.
Well, it was definitely seen as strongly progressive by many people at the time. Even some conservative Catholics might have been, taken aback by how direct and robust its engagement was with social and economic issues, things that previously might have been seen as purely secular concerns.
So some internal debate within the church hierarchy.
Oh, certainly. While it was welcomed by many, it definitely spurred considerable debate. This idea of the church stepping so directly into social commentary and policy implications wasn't an easy transition for everyone. It marked a real shift in perceived responsibilities.
And what about those outside the church? The socialists, the capitalists, the people on opposite sides of this big ideological divide?
Well, socialists naturally had their criticisms. For instance, Henry George, a prominent American economist and advocate for land reform, argued quite strongly against Leo's defense of private property, particularly land, claiming its abolition was actually justified by divine law. So, direct disagreement there.
And the capitalists.
You can imagine that many capitalists, especially those who were benefiting greatly from the system of unchecked competition, likely viewed its calls for state intervention, for just wages, for unions, with a healthy dose of skepticism, if not outright opposition. It challenged their way of operating.
But it wasn't universally panned outside the church either.
No, not at all. It was actually lauded by some mainstream journalists. For example, the Pall Mall magazine in Britain called it a magnificent confirmation from the papal chair of Cardinal Manning's doctrines. Cardinal Manning was a key English cardinal who had strongly supported workers, famously intervening in the London dock strike of 1889, and he was influential in shaping the encyclical. So it clearly resonated beyond just Catholic circles.
Interesting. Now, beyond those immediate reactions, Rerum Novarum seems to have triggered some pretty significant institutional changes. This wasn't just a theoretical document left on a shelf. It became a catalyst for real action, didn't it?
Absolutely. It really lit a fire under Catholic activists. It became a central text, a kind of manifesto for Catholic action movements that sprang up in various European countries. These movements encouraged lay Catholics, ordinary people, not just clergy, to get actively involved in social and political life, specifically to apply the principles laid out in the encyclical.
And what about those unions it championed?
It definitely spurred the formation and growth of specifically Christian-inspired trade unions. These were often distinct from the more secular or explicitly socialist unions. They focused on cooperation, mutual aid among members, while still advocating strongly for workers' rights based on the encyclical's principles.
And it also seems to have pushed Catholics towards engaging more seriously with fields like economics and sociology.
Yes, that's right. The encyclical's detailed analysis of the economic and social conditions of the time essentially served as a wake-up call. It encouraged a much more robust Catholic engagement with these fields. Catholics who, as the encyclical put it, understood what the times require, really strove to better the condition of the working class by rightful means.
What kind of means?
Well, for instance, they formed practical things like benefit and insurance societies. These were designed to help workers and their families during times of calamity accidents, sickness, old age. This wasn't just theory. It led to concrete actions on the ground, creating real social safety nets, often decades before governments widely adopted similar measures. The document really ignited this movement of social responsibility within the church.
Its legislative influence also seems profound, even if indirect. Can you give us a sense of how its ideas might have trickled into actual policy changes in different countries?
It's often indirect, as you say, because it didn't lay out specific laws. But Rerum Novarum provided this powerful moral and intellectual framework that undeniably influenced the development of labor laws in various countries over time. Its principles, like the need for just wages, limits on working hours, protection for women and children, the right to organize, they fed into the public debate and legislative efforts.
Can you see connections to later major policy shifts?
You can certainly see implicit connections to later social welfare policies. Some argue you can see echoes of its concerns, if not direct lineage, in aspects of programs like the New Deal in the United States during the Great Depression, particularly its efforts to address mass unemployment, establish social safety nets, regulate working conditions, and protect union rights. Or even earlier in the push for child labor laws and minimum wage concepts that gained traction in the early 20th century.
And politically, did it influence political parties?
Yes, significantly. It became a foundational document for the emergence and platform of Christian democratic parties, especially in Europe. These parties aim to offer a political third way, an alternative to both purely socialist parties on the left and classical liberal or conservative parties on the right. They politically organized Catholic movements pushing for social reforms that clearly echoed Rerum Novarum's vision of social justice tempered by tradition and morality.
And theologically, its impact is immense. It's considered the foundational text of modern Catholic social teaching. It formalized key principles like implicitly introducing subsidiarity, emphasizing local action, and limiting excessive state control.
Absolutely. And its ongoing legacy is crystal clear when you look at how subsequent papal encyclicals explicitly built upon and celebrated Rerum Novarum's themes. Pope Pius II's Quadragesimo Anno, issued exactly 40 years later in 1931, directly commemorates and expands on it. Then you have Paul VI's Octogesima Adveniens 80 years later, and John Paul II's Centesimus Annus celebrating the centenary in 1991.
So each built on the last.
Each explicitly revisited Rerum Novarum, reaffirming its core principles while applying them to the new challenges of their own times: fascism, communism, post-war reconstruction, globalization, the fall of the Berlin Wall. It shows how the Church's social teaching evolves organically, maintaining core principles while responding dynamically to new historical circumstances, all tracing back to Leo XIII's groundbreaking work.
This brings up an important concept often associated with Catholic social teaching, the preferential option for the poor. Now, that specific phrase wasn't actually in Rerum Novarum, was it? But how did Leo's encyclical lay the groundwork for it?
That's a great point, and you're right. The phrase itself came into common usage much later, really gaining traction in the 1970s, largely thanks to Latin American liberation theologians, especially after the influential Medellin Conference of Latin American bishops in 1968.
But the spirit was there in 1891.
Absolutely. The spirit is undeniably there in Rerum Novarum. It speaks powerfully about God's compassion and favor for the poor. Its insistence that the state must specially care for and protect wage earners, who were by far the majority and often the most vulnerable class, clearly paved the way for the central tenet of modern Catholic social teaching. The profound concern for the marginalized wasn't just presented as a nice idea, it was framed as a fundamental moral imperative for both individuals and the state. It laid the ethical foundation.
Okay, so we've journeyed through this monumental document from over 130 years ago, but this is the deep dive, so let's really push this into our present. How do these century-old insights, forged in the heat of the Industrial Revolution, actually apply to the completely new kind of revolutionary change happening right now, particularly with artificial intelligence? It really does feel like we're facing a comparable paradigm shift, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And the source material we looked at draws that comparison explicitly. It notes that just as the Industrial Revolution utterly transformed labor, society, everything, artificial intelligence represents a comparable paradigm shift. And what's so fascinating, and maybe a bit unsettling, is how the core questions about human dignity, the meaning of work, social justice, the role of property, the common good, just reemerge with such force in this brand new technological context, often with some really striking parallels to the 19th century.
Okay, let's start with the big one. Artificial intelligence and automation. On one hand, AI promises incredible leaps in efficiency, new capabilities we can barely imagine. But on the other, it poses this huge threat to human labor, right? We're talking potential job displacement on a massive scale.
That's right. AI and robotics aren't just threatening manual labor anymore. They're increasingly capable of sophisticated cognitive work, too. This creates, as one source puts it, the risk of creating a permanent class of unemployable humans, or at least a very large segment of the population struggling to find meaningful, stable work.
And this immediately brings us back to Rerum Novarum's absolute bedrock, human dignity. If people are increasingly valued only for their economic productivity, especially in a world where machines can often outperform them, what happens to their inherent worth?
Exactly. That core assertion from Rerum Novarum that humans are not mere instruments of production becomes incredibly potent again. It forces us to ask, what is truly irreducibly human that AI cannot replicate? How do we structure society and the economy to ensure we don't fall into the trap of valuing people only for their output, their efficiency, their contribution to the bottom line? This isn't just an economic calculation. It feels existential.
So if Leo XIII was deeply concerned about unjust burdens and how the abolition of the guilds left workers feeling isolated and helpless, what does that perspective tell us about the modern platform economy, the world of gig workers?
It's a really eerie echo, isn't it? These AI-driven platforms, while often incredibly efficient and convenient for us as consumers, frequently operate by pushing workers, delivery drivers, content moderators, freelance writers, you name it, right to their limits. They use algorithmic management, gamification, constant performance metrics, all designed, as one source noted, to extract maximum value from human labor while minimizing platform responsibility.
It sounds like a high-tech version of the old pressures.
In some ways, yes. These systems can nudge or even effectively coerce workers into patterns that might be unhealthy or unsustainable, essentially creating a new form of precarious, atomized labor.
But how do you even begin to apply concepts like a just wage when it's an algorithm, not a human manager, setting your pay, often through totally opaque processes? And where does the right to association, the right to form unions, fit in when you have a dispersed, fragmented, gig-based workforce that often lacks those traditional employer-employee ties?
That's precisely the challenge, isn't it? Rerum Novarum wasn't just arguing for any wage, but a living wage, one that supported a family and allowed for savings. It specifically called out exploitation, where workers accept terrible conditions simply out of necessity or fear of a worse evil. We have to seriously ask if algorithms, in their relentless programmed pursuit of efficiency and profit maximization, are inadvertently recreating those exact conditions today, prioritizing platform output over genuine human dignity and well-being.
So what's the response?
Well, the principle suggests we need to find ways to ensure algorithm transparency and fairness in compensation. And how can society, perhaps drawing inspiration from Leo's call, encourage new forms of associations or collective bargaining structures that can protect these newly atomized workers? How do they get a collective voice? How do we prevent what you might call algorithmic exploitation? It demands we innovate new social protections for this new technological age.
Then there's the huge, persistent issue of wealth inequality. There's a real concern that the benefits of AI won't be distributed equitably at all, that it could massively amplify existing inequalities, create new forms of exclusion, and potentially lead to this stark division, a tiny billionaire class versus growing poverty.
This is a direct hit on Rerum Novarum's core principle of the common good. If AI development, ownership, and access become heavily concentrated in the hands of a few corporations or individuals, it risks creating a deeply stratified society. One where some benefit astronomically from technological progress while huge numbers are left behind, or even further marginalized economically and socially.
So how does the encyclical's thinking apply?
Well, its emphasis on the social obligations of property, including intellectual property and capital, compels us to ask tough questions. How should AI development and governance be structured to genuinely reflect and serve the common good? What role should ethical actors, including the church, governments, civil society, play in advocating for equitable AI access, fair distribution of its benefits, and maybe even retraining programs, ensuring that this powerful innovation doesn't just serve the already privileged, but actually helps lift all boats?
And shifting gears slightly, while climate change obviously wasn't on Leo XIII's radar in 1891, the source material connects it through the broader principle of stewardship, which is deeply embedded in Catholic social teaching. How does AI intersect with this crucial challenge of balancing environmental care and economic development?
It's a really complex intersection. On the one hand, AI can be an incredibly powerful tool for environmental protection. Think about its potential for climate modeling, optimizing energy grids, developing sustainable agriculture, monitoring deforestation or pollution in real time.
Huge potential benefits.
Huge. But on the other hand, AI itself has a significant environmental footprint. Training these large language models, running massive data centers, it consumes enormous amounts of energy and resources, contributing to carbon emissions. So the ethical framework of stewardship, rooted in the idea that we are caretakers of creation, forces us to ask, how do we harness AI's potential for good while mitigating its environmental costs? How do we ensure this technology truly serves long-term human flourishing and creation care, not just short-term economic gain or unchecked technological expansion?
Another really tricky area is intellectual property and the democratization of knowledge. AI systems are trained on these colossal data sets of human-created content, text, images, music, often scraped from the internet without explicit permission or compensation for the original creators. And now these systems can generate new works that compete directly with human artists, writers, musicians. Our traditional copyright laws seem completely unprepared for this.
They really do seem inadequate. And this is where Rerum Novarum's careful balancing act between the right to private property, including the fruits of one's intellectual labor, and the social responsibility that comes with it becomes incredibly relevant again.
How so?
We have to grapple with fundamental questions. Does the principle of the universal destination of goods, the ancient Christian idea that the Earth's resources are ultimately meant to benefit all humanity, apply somehow to intellectual property in this digital age? How do we justly balance the rights of human creators to be recognized and compensated for their work, their natural right to the fruit of their labor, as Leo might put it, with AI's unprecedented potential to democratize access to knowledge and creative tools?
What is just compensation when human creativity becomes mere input data for an AI model? And what are the ethics of AI-generated content potentially displacing human creators on a large scale?
Exactly. It forces a fundamental reevaluation of concepts like authorship, ownership, value, and fair use in this rapidly evolving digital landscape. There are no easy answers here.
And what's also deeply concerning is the potential for AI exploitation, especially of youth and vulnerable populations. We see it already, perhaps, with social media algorithms, which are AI-driven, designed primarily to maximize engagement time. They often seem to do this by exploiting psychological vulnerabilities, maybe even manipulating young people through highly personalized, sometimes harmful or addictive content.
This resonates very strongly with Rerum Novarum's specific concern for protecting the vulnerable, particularly children. Remember how Leo XIII condemned practices that blighted the young promise of children in factories? Well, today we need to ask analogous questions. How does the fundamental duty to protect children apply to these powerful AI platforms? What ethical frameworks and regulations should govern AI systems that interact directly with minors, whose developing minds are uniquely susceptible to manipulation, addiction, or exposure to inappropriate or harmful content?
It calls for a really robust defense of childhood, doesn't it?
Yeah. It really does. A defense of innocence and healthy development against technologies that might prioritize clicks, engagement metrics, and profit above the well-being of young users.
And finally, there's this looming specter of technological collectivism. The idea that AI systems could enable unprecedented surveillance and social control, that algorithmic decision-making in areas like hiring, loans, or even policing might erode individual autonomy and introduce hidden biases. Could the sheer scale of data collection and the idea of sharing all human knowledge via AI echo some of the collectivist approaches that Leo XIII warned against in socialism?
It's a profound and subtle concern. Obviously, collaboration and sharing knowledge can be immensely positive. But the encyclical warned against forms of collectivism that, in its view, defrauded man of what his own labor has produced and ultimately undermine individual freedom and responsibility.
So how does that apply to AI?
Well, AI's ability to gather and analyze vast quantities of personal data, and for complex algorithms to make decisions that profoundly affect individual lives, often without transparency or recourse, raises critical questions about privacy, autonomy, and bias. How do we safeguard individual freedom and human agency while still benefiting from AI's potential for collective intelligence and problem solving? How do we distinguish between voluntary, beneficial knowledge sharing and forms of data collection or algorithmic control that feel potentially coercive or overly intrusive, maybe even leading towards a surveillance state? It forces us to revisit that fundamental balance between individual liberty and societal order, but in a totally new technological context.
Okay, so we've laid out these truly immense contemporary challenges, touching on everything from jobs to privacy to climate change. How can the enduring applications, the core wisdom from Rerum Novarum, actually guide us in navigating these? For instance, how might its principles inform the ongoing debates around universal basic income, UBI, through a Catholic lens?
That's a really fascinating intersection. If automation genuinely leads to widespread, persistent job displacement, then Rerum Novarum's principles, things like the right to work for sustenance, the inherent dignity of every person regardless of employment status, the duty to provide for basic needs become incredibly relevant to the UBI discussion.
So UBI could be seen as aligning with those principles.
It could be seen as one potential way to ensure basic material sustenance in such a future, fulfilling that duty to provide. However, the encyclical also places enormous emphasis on the dignity of work itself, not just as a means to income, but as a form of human participation, creativity, and contribution to the common good.
So it's not just about getting a check.
Right. So the deeper question, informed by Rerum Novarum, becomes, If UBI is implemented, how do we ensure it doesn't just become a handout, but is part of a broader societal structure that still enables people to find purpose, to contribute meaningfully, to participate actively in community life, addressing not just material needs, but also that inherent human need for fulfillment and activity that the encyclical spoke so powerfully about? It's about ensuring human flourishing, not just subsistence.
And what about the business world? The encyclical's vision of harmony between capital and labor, its stress on mutual rights and duties, can we see that as a sort of precursor to modern ideas like stakeholder capitalism and corporate social responsibility? It seems to push beyond just maximizing shareholder profit.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a very direct connection. Rerum Novarum fundamentally argued that capital and labor are not enemies, but interdependent partners. Their relationship, it insisted, should be governed by justice and charity, not just by raw economic power or market forces.
And that sounds like stakeholder theory.
It's precisely the ethical foundation for stakeholder capitalism, which argues that corporations have responsibilities not just to their shareholders, capital, but to all their stakeholders, their employees, labor, their customers, their suppliers, the communities they operate in, and increasingly the environment. It pushes us towards a model where business is understood as serving the common good, not just generating private gain for a select few. It's about creating value for everyone involved.
This also seems highly relevant for technology regulation and ensuring human flourishing, that principle of subsidiarity we discussed, and the call for the state to intervene when necessary to protect the common good, especially the vulnerable other. That sounds like a solid framework for thinking about ethical AI governance.
Indeed, it does. Subsidiarity suggests that AI governance shouldn't just be top-down, dictated solely by governments or tech giants. It implies that regulation and ethical oversight should involve multiple levels of society, industry bodies, academic experts, civil society organizations, local communities, maybe even individual users having more control over their data and how AI affects them.
So involving everyone, not just the elites.
Right. It emphasizes that those closest to the specific applications and impacts of the technology should have a meaningful voice in its development and deployment. It's a call for a more distributed sense of responsibility, a more democratic approach to technological oversight, all aimed at ensuring that technology remains a tool that truly serves human flourishing, aligned with human values, rather than becoming an autonomous force that dictates our future.
And this whole evolving thread of Catholic social teaching, starting so clearly with Rerum Novarum, continues right up to the present day. You see it powerfully in Pope Francis's major encyclical Laudato Si on care for our common home. How does that document build directly on Leo XIII's foundation, showing this ongoing relevance?
Laudato Si is really a beautiful and powerful expansion of the core themes found in Rerum Novarum. While Leo XIII was primarily focused on the dire social and economic conditions stemming from the Industrial Revolution, the social question of his day, Pope Francis takes that same concern for justice, dignity, and the common good and explicitly broadens it to include environmental stewardship, addressing the ecological question of our day.
He connects the social and the environmental.
Exactly. He speaks compellingly of an integral ecology, emphasizing that everything is interconnected. How we treat the earth is fundamentally linked to how we treat each other, especially the poor and vulnerable who often suffer most from environmental degradation. He argues you can't solve the social crisis without solving the environmental crisis, and vice versa. It demonstrates perfectly how Rerum Novarum's foundational message about human dignity, solidarity, the common good, and mutual responsibility continues to be applied, deepened, and expanded to address the evolving, complex, interconnected challenges facing humanity from the 19th century factory floor to the 21st century global climate.
What an incredible journey we've taken. From those grimy, dangerous factories of the first industrial revolution to the complex, potentially disruptive algorithms of the AI revolution today, Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum really does feel prophetic. It remains a remarkably relevant document here in the 21st century.
It really does. Our sources rightly described it as both a criticism of the perceived illusions of socialism and a primer of the Catholic response to the exploitation of workers. It wasn't merely a reaction against things. It was this foundational, positive statement that tried to chart a humane course forward.
And its pivotal role seems undeniable, shaping not just Catholic thought, but feeding into these broader, ongoing discussions about labor rights, social justice, and that incredibly delicate balance between individual freedom and our collective well-being.
Absolutely. It powerfully demonstrated the Church's capacity, and perhaps its duty, to engage seriously with evolving societal challenges, drawing on its deep wellspring of ancient wisdom to address these new things. Rerum Novarum as they emerge, generation after generation. It established a model for offering a consistent moral voice in a world that's constantly changing.
So after this deep dive today, thinking about everything we've discussed,
Right.
what stands out particularly to you from this century-old document? How do you see these ideas resonating with the specific challenges you encounter or observe in the world today, whether that's in the gig economy, the rise of AI, persistent wealth disparity, or something else?
That's a great question for reflection.
And we really encourage you, our listeners, to continue engaging with these powerful ideas. Maybe seek out and read some excerpts from Rerum Novarum itself. It's surprisingly accessible in parts. Or perhaps explore more about the rich tradition of Catholic social teaching and how it's being applied to contemporary issues like artificial intelligence or climate change. The conversation definitely doesn't end here.
And as we close out this deep dive, perhaps consider this final provocative thought. Rerum Novarum articulated so forcefully this enduring fundamental tension between respecting human dignity and the relentless drive for economic efficiency. How do we, individually and collectively, consistently prioritize the human person, not just as a means to an economic end, but as the very purpose and measure of all economic and technological progress? That's the challenge Leo XIII laid down.
And building on that, think about Leo XIII's strong conviction that society would be healthier, more stable, and more just if many more people could actually own property, build up some savings, have a stake in the system. How does that core principle, so vital in his time for breaking cycles of poverty and dependence, translate into our modern age? An age often characterized by digital assets, intellectual property, gig work, and increasingly concentrated wealth in intangible forms, is a question that continues to challenge us profoundly, demanding new, creative answers rooted in that timeless wisdom. Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.